Now, I want you to take a moment and think, not just with your head, but with your spirit. Why do nations make the choices they do? Why does power flow in certain directions? You see, everything in this world, whether it's a business deal, a personal decision, or a strategic alliance, follows a certain law, a law of cause and effect. And when we understand that law, when we learn to work with it, we start seeing not just what is, but what can be. Perception is one of the most powerful forces shaping our reality, and this principle doesn't only apply to individuals, it governs nations too. How a country perceives another, how it interprets intent, threat, or opportunity, forms the very basis of its foreign policy. In the case of U.S. aid to Pakistan and its subsequent ripple effects on India-U.S. relations, perception becomes a decisive force in strategic calculations. When the United States channels aid to Pakistan, whether military, economic, or humanitarian, it's not just transferring resources, it's transferring a signal. That signal, consciously or unconsciously, is received differently by different actors. For the U.S. policy architects, it may be framed as an instrument for regional stability, a leverage point in the fight against extremism, or a geopolitical balancing act in South Asia. But for Indian policymakers, that same aid often triggers a very different chain of thought. It's seen through a historical lens of mistrust, competition, and concern over Pakistan's use of external resources to fund anti-India strategies, especially those involving cross-border terrorism. This divergence in perception is not incidental. It's strategic, because perception determines meaning, and meaning influences reaction. If one side sees aid as a stabilizing force, while the other views it as an enabler of insecurity, both sides are operating in completely different paradigms. That gap in perception can widen diplomatic rifts, slow trust building, and introduce tension even in areas where interests align. What's important to understand is that policy is rarely just a reaction to facts. More often, it is a reaction to the interpretation of those facts. Interpretation, in turn, is deeply rooted in belief systems, historical context, and strategic worldviews. India's perception of U.S. aid to Pakistan is shaped by decades of conflict, wars, and covert operations. It's shaped by the memory of times when American weapons ended up being used not against terrorists, but against Indian soldiers. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition, based on lived geopolitical experience. From the American side, there's often a blind spot, a gap in understanding how deeply this aid is tied to India's internal security psyche. This is not merely about diplomacy or defense. It's about psychological posture. India, as an emerging superpower, is no longer content with being a passive observer to these moves. Its perception is more assertive, more strategic, and less forgiving of inconsistency. If the U.S. wants a genuinely robust partnership with India, it must begin by acknowledging this perceptual gap and working to align interpretations, not just policies. The concept of strategic calculus demands that decision makers consider not only direct consequences, but perceptual reverberations. Perception can convert a benign action into a hostile move. It can transform a gesture of support into a symbol of betrayal. This is particularly true in a region as volatile and emotionally charged as South Asia, where history is long, wounds are deep, and trust is hard-earned. A dollar sent to Islamabad doesn't just appear in a ledger, it echoes in New Delhi, where analysts, diplomats, and defense planners recalibrate their models and assumptions. This is why shifting perception is not a superficial exercise, it's foundational. Strategic success lies in the ability to understand how your actions are perceived beyond your intent. That's where power truly lies, not in the action itself, but in the interpretation of that action. If the United States can learn to see through India's lens, not to agree blindly, but to empathize and factor it into its strategic design, then it begins to unlock a new dimension in bilateral relations. It's about raising the level of thinking. Just as individuals can change their lives by shifting paradigms, Nations can change their destinies by reevaluating how they perceive one another. When policy is elevated by perception that is informed, that it is understood, sensitive, and aligned with long-term vision, then strategy moves from reaction to intention, from confusion to clarity. Aid in the realm of international relations is never a neutral act. It's never simply about compassion, development, or moral responsibility. At its core, aid is a tool, an instrument of influence, of leverage, of strategic positioning. When the United States sends aid to Pakistan, it's not merely giving money or resources. It's placing a calculated bet. It's entering into a transactional relationship wrapped in the language of diplomacy. Every dollar sent carries with it expectations, assumptions, and strategic motives that go far beyond humanitarian intent. This principle becomes even more significant when the recipient of that aid is a nation like Pakistan, a country positioned at a geopolitical crossroads, historically tethered to complex U.S. interests in South Asia and the Middle East. The narrative often projected is that this aid supports counterterrorism, strengthens democratic institutions, or stabilizes a volatile region. But the subtext is much deeper. The aid ensures access, cooperation, and compliance. It acts as a mechanism through which the U.S. retains a degree of control, or at least influence, over Pakistan's internal and regional behavior. The real nature of aid in international strategy must be viewed through a power lens. Aid is not just given, it is invested, and every investment expects a return. Whether that return is political alignment, intelligence collaboration, logistical support, or containment of adversarial behavior, the donor expects outcomes that serve its own interests. The relationship between the United States and Pakistan has been defined by this underlying truth. While public statements may emphasize mutual benefit, the structure of the aid dynamic reveals the asymmetry. Pakistan receives funds, military hardware, and diplomatic cushioning. The U.S., in return, seeks strategic access, a listening post in South Asia, and a foothold near Afghanistan, China, and Iran. From India's perspective, this equation appears contradictory. On one hand, the U.S. champions democratic values, supports India's rise on the global stage, and emphasizes a strong bilateral partnership. On the other hand, it continues to pour billions into a state whose policies and actions have often run counter to India's security and regional interests. India sees this not just as a double standard, but as a calculated compromise by the U.S., a compromise made in pursuit of broader geopolitical goals. And this perception drives a wedge in trust. What makes this even more problematic is the inconsistency with which conditions are enforced. Time and again, U.S. aid to Pakistan has been criticized for lacking accountability. Despite assurances, funds have often ended up supporting military expansion, some of which directly affect India's national security. Even more concerning is the belief that a portion of this aid indirectly sustains networks that propagate extremism, networks that spill across borders and disrupt regional peace. India, with its own history of being targeted by these forces, finds it difficult to reconcile U.S. financial support to Pakistan with its own aspirations for a genuine, values-based partnership with America. This is where the distinction between intent and impact becomes crucial. The U.S. may intend its aid to serve a stabilizing purpose, but the impact, as perceived and experienced by India, often signals something very different. The strategic influence the U.S. hopes to gain in Islamabad can easily translate into strategic anxiety in New Delhi. And when strategic anxiety replaces strategic alignment, the entire architecture of bilateral cooperation begins to weaken. Understanding this nuance requires stepping out of conventional narratives. Aid must be seen as part of a larger chessboard, not as a charitable gesture. It must be understood in terms of trade-offs, calculations, and layered intentions. In South Asia's fragile balance of power, every financial commitment echoes politically, militarily, and symbolically. The aid itself might be measured in billions of dollars, but its real cost is measured in perception, alignment, and trust. Nations don't react to aid in isolation. They respond to what that aid represents. Trust between nations much like between individuals, is not built on lofty rhetoric or grand gestures. It is built on clarity, clarity of purpose, clarity of intent, and above all, clarity of action. When ambiguity enters the space between two strategic partners, mistrust follows close behind. India-U.S. relations have evolved significantly over the past 2 decades, moving from cautious diplomacy to shared visions of a free and open Indo-Pacific, deepening defense cooperation and alignment in technology, trade, and counterterrorism. But that trajectory depends not on convenience or fluctuating alliances. It depends on unwavering clarity. Convenience-based diplomacy is transactional and short-term. It involves shifting positions to accommodate immediate goals, often at the expense of long-term trust. This approach can lead to fractured partnerships, especially when one side begins to feel that it is being treated as a secondary option or a backup plan. India, with its rising geopolitical influence and long memory of Cold War-era alignments, is particularly sensitive to any signs of transactionalism in its partnerships. When the United States extends strategic cooperation with India on one hand, while continuing military and economic assistance to Pakistan on the other, it risks appearing as if it's hedging its bets, playing both sides to maintain leverage. Clarity, by contrast, signals commitment. It tells a partner, you matter, not just because it's convenient right now, but because your interests are interwoven with ours. India seeks that kind of clarity from the United States. As a democratic powerhouse in Asia, India doesn't aspire to dominance through dependence. It aspires to partnership through mutual respect. And respect demands transparency in action. When Washington articulates support for India's security and global role, but simultaneously aids a state that India perceives as an enabler of its primary threats, the clarity of commitment becomes blurred. India understands the complexities of U.S. foreign policy. It knows that great powers balance multiple priorities across different theaters. But it also expects coherence, an alignment between words and deeds. Trust is not broken when differences arise. It is broken when patterns of inconsistency emerge. A major area where this inconsistency is felt is in the narrative around counterterrorism. The U.S. often emphasizes its desire to dismantle terrorist networks, many of which operate from Pakistani soil. Yet when aid continues to flow to the very regime accused of harboring or tolerating those networks, India finds itself questioning the depth of that commitment. It is important to note that India does not seek a veto over U.S. aid policy. What it seeks is a recognition of its security concerns as valid and non-negotiable, and what it seeks is a recognition of its security concerns as valid and non-clarity in relations would mean that the United States not only acknowledges these concerns privately, but reflects that understanding in the public and policy spheres. This includes transparent metrics for aid, strict accountability mechanisms, and clear communication around the objectives of any engagement with Pakistan. Strategic ambiguity may work in certain regions, but in South Asia, where history is heavy and suspicion is ingrained, it often backfires. The India-U.S. relationship has tremendous potential. It is a relationship grounded not just in shared democratic values, but in a shared future. Both nations face common challenges: the rise of authoritarianism, the reshaping of global trade, and the threat of transnational terrorism. These challenges require not occasional alignment, but deep trust. And trust can't be outsourced to circumstance. It must be earned and reaffirmed constantly through decisions that reflect consistency. India does not expect blind loyalty. It expects clarity, that its interests are not just acknowledged, but understood at a strategic level. It expects that when lines are drawn, they are not blurred by short-term expediencies, because clarity, once established, becomes the most powerful driver of enduring cooperation. Strategic calculus is not an emotional game. It is a disciplined, deliberate process that demands a level of thinking above the noise of politics, media narratives, and historical grievances. In international relations, the most effective players are not those who react emotionally, but those who detach, observe, and calculate from a place of clarity. Emotional responses in geopolitics may win headlines, but they rarely win outcomes. Strategic decisions that shape the course of alliances, conflicts, or partnerships are the product of vision, not reaction. The India-U.S. relationship, particularly in the context of U.S. aid to Pakistan, presents a challenge that tests this principle deeply. From India's point of view, the aid extended to Pakistan often appears as a betrayal of mutual values or strategic alignment. There is a temptation to respond emotionally, to frame it as favoritism, neglect, or duplicity. But when viewed through the lens of strategic calculus, the picture becomes more complex. The U.S., in its own right, is pursuing layered interests that intersect in various theaters: Afghanistan, the Indo-Pacific, Central Asia, and the Middle East. It is not necessarily choosing Pakistan over India. It is, at times, acting out of its own strategic inertia or competing imperatives. For India to elevate its position as a global power, it must cultivate the ability to think beyond these emotional impulses. Strategic calculus requires understanding not just what your partner is doing, but why they're doing it. It means studying their interests, constraints, and global objectives with an analytical mindset. Detachment doesn't imply indifference. It means not allowing anger or frustration to cloud judgment. It means assessing moves not as insults, but as inputs in a larger equation. This detachment allows for a long game approach. Instead of confronting every instance of perceived imbalance with outrage, a nation rooted in strategic thinking uses these moments to clarify its own position, assert its priorities, and quietly recalculate the dynamics. It begins to recognize patterns, predict responses, and prepare alternatives. Emotion may drive urgency, but only vision creates direction. And vision is what separates reactionary states from strategic ones. The United States, too, benefits when India approaches the relationship from this elevated mindset. A calm, rational, and visionary India becomes a more reliable and credible partner. It becomes a nation that commands respect not through volume, but through consistency. It becomes a country that makes the case for deeper cooperation not through complaint, but through competence and strategic clarity. When India focuses on its own trajectory, economic, technological, military, and positions itself as indispensable to regional and global stability, it changes the entire frame of the conversation. Strategic detachment does not mean surrendering one's principles. On the contrary, it means using those principles to shape smarter actions. India's concerns over U.S. aid to Pakistan are legitimate, but the way to address those concerns is not through reactive diplomacy or emotional rhetoric. The way forward is to demonstrate, through action and consistency, that India's partnership offers the United States far greater long-term value than its transactional engagements elsewhere. This requires a cultural shift in how strategy is approached. In public discourse, foreign policy is often painted in black and white, ally or enemy, support or betrayal. But real strategy lives in the gray. It recognizes nuance, contradiction, and evolving priorities. For India to fully claim its role as a global leader, it must embrace this complexity and use it to its advantage. Strategic calculus also demands patience. Shifts in policy, influence, and alignment take time. Detachment gives room for that time to unfold without succumbing to short-term provocation. Vision provides the roadmap. When India operates from that place, not reacting, but anticipating, not demanding, but demonstrating, it strengthens its position in every multilateral forum, every bilateral negotiation, and every global alliance. Geopolitics at its core is energy. It is the movement of influence, pressure, and ambition across borders, institutions, and ideologies. Just like energy in physics, geopolitical energy flows along paths of least resistance, gathering momentum where there is vacuum and shifting direction in response to friction and force. Understanding this dynamic allows nations to move from being passive subjects of global shifts to becoming active architects of the international order. Control the flow of that energy, whether through diplomacy, trade, military alliances, or soft power, and you control outcomes. When the United States decides to allocate aid to Pakistan, it is channeling energy. That energy can manifest as economic stability, military readiness, or even diplomatic leverage. The flow of this energy is not random. It follows specific patterns shaped by historical relationships, immediate strategic concerns, and long-term calculation. For the U.S., Pakistan has often been a conduit for influence in South Asia and the broader Islamic world. The aid is not just about development. It is about maintaining a foothold, preserving options, and countering threats, perceived or real. But here lies the deeper layer. Whenever the United States sends energy into Pakistan, it simultaneously alters the regional energy balance. India feels this shift not in a hypothetical or abstract sense, but in very tangible terms. Military preparedness along its borders, diplomatic postures at international forums, and the funding channels that sometimes feed into hostile non-state actors. Energy cannot be contained once released. It flows, it transforms, and it impacts beyond its immediate target. Thus, U.S. aid to Pakistan is never a bilateral act. It is a regional intervention. India, in this context, must begin to think in terms of energy flow, not static policy. It must ask, where is influence moving? Who is channeling it? And toward what end? Control does not always come from the size of your economy or military. It comes from your ability to shape the flow of influence. This means creating attractive alternatives for cooperation, building robust economic corridors, developing strategic infrastructure, and leveraging diplomatic platforms to redirect attention and investment. In this game of flows, perception is power. If a country is seen as a source of stability, innovation, and growth, it begins to attract energy, investment, alliances, talent. If it is seen as a source of volatility or indecision, it repels that energy. India's position must therefore be grounded not only in security responses, but in becoming a gravitational center of positive influence. When other nations see India as a rising, responsible, and visionary power, the flow of geopolitical energy will begin to move in its favor, regardless of who receives financial aid in the short term. The U.S., too, must recognize the consequences of how it channels its strategic energy. Every dollar given, every diplomatic signal sent, is part of a broader current. If the current begins to erode trust with India, it risks weakening a relationship that is vital for long-term U.S. interests in the Indo-Pacific. Managing energy flow means understanding not only where influence is being applied, but how it is being interpreted by others in the system. India's approach to U.S. aid to Pakistan should not be limited to protest or passive observation. It should be proactive, creating its own channels of influence that are more compelling, more transparent, and more sustainable. It should focus on becoming a net provider of security and opportunity in the region, thereby shifting the flow of strategic energy organically. Rather than constantly reacting to others' movements, India should become the nation others must respond to. The tools for this are already available: technology leadership, cultural diplomacy, strategic investments, and a growing global diaspora that carries Indian values and capabilities across continents. Each of these is a vector for energy, a force multiplier that extends India's reach far beyond its borders. Control the flow, and you begin to shape outcomes not just in South Asia, but across the global order. In the complex field of geopolitics, the difference between reacting to external pressures and creating a proactive national strategy defines a country's true influence. Reaction keeps a nation tied to the momentum of others, always on the defensive, always adjusting to shifting conditions. Creation, on the other hand, allows a nation to define its space, set its terms, and shape the environment around it. In the context of India-U.S. relations and U.S. aid to Pakistan, India stands at a critical juncture. It must decide whether to continue reacting to external moves or rise to the level of strategy where it becomes the author of its own geopolitical narrative. India has, for decades, dealt with the implications of American assistance to Pakistan. This pattern is not new. But today, India has more power, more leverage, and more global recognition than ever before. It has the tools to move from complaint to creation, from insecurity to influence. To achieve this shift, India must redefine how it sees itself in the larger global framework. It must stop viewing decisions made in Washington or Islamabad as primary determinants of its regional standing and instead begin to construct a future grounded in national vision and strategic initiative. When a nation reacts, it gives away its psychological and diplomatic upper hand. Each time India protests a U.S.-Pakistan transaction, it risks appearing as though it is waiting for external validation, as though its own strength and status are contingent on others' actions. This posture weakens its long-term influence. Instead, India should step into a posture of quiet strength, acknowledging global dynamics but staying centered in its own path. That path must be defined by internal growth, regional leadership, and global contribution. This requires India to invest heavily in its strategic storytelling. Global influence is not only about military or economic power, it is also about narrative power. Who defines the problem? Who sets the terms of the debate? Who frames the values that are considered desirable or legitimate? If India allows others to define it as a reactive player, then that perception will shape decisions in Washington, Brussels, or Tokyo. But if India positions itself as a creator of solutions, a driver of innovation, and a guardian of regional balance, it begins to influence not just policy, but mindset. Creation also demands internal alignment. A nation cannot project strategic clarity outward if it is divided or distracted within. Economic policy, technological advancement, educational reform, and governance must all work together to form a cohesive vision. When India's domestic strength is visible and coherent, it enhances its credibility as a partner and a power. The shift from reaction to creation begins at home, with clarity in purpose and consistency in execution. India must also scale its presence in global forums, not just to participate, but to lead. This includes proposing frameworks for South Asian stability, offering alternative models for development cooperation, and setting agendas on digital governance, climate action, and counterterrorism. When India leads, it attracts. And when it attracts, it repositions itself at the center of the strategic chessboard. In that position, the decisions of others become less threatening and more manageable, because India is no longer simply navigating the waves, it is setting the tide. The key is to recognize that influence is not granted, it is created. Waiting for the U.S. to stop funding Pakistan is a limited strategy. Building a compelling alternative that makes such funding less relevant is transformative. India has the intellectual, diplomatic, and economic capital to redefine the region's security architecture, to make its own presence indispensable to U.S. objectives, and to render obsolete the traditional justifications for aid to adversarial neighbors. This is the essence of creative strategy, shaping the environment so that others adjust to your presence, not the other way around.